Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Tanner, and today I'll be joined not by Taylor, but by another special guest. But before we get into the episode, we do have some new patrons to thank. So I want to give a shout out to Tom and Anne. So thanks so much for supporting the show, and we hope you enjoy the bonus episodes. And for patrons, a little sneak peek for March. We'll be watching The Hunt for Red October, continuing with our quest to watch every submarine film known to man. So now I guess I'll bring in our guest for today and the one who's going to be doing most of the talking, returning Beyond the Breakers champion, Paul. How's it going, Paul?
Hey, great. Glad to be on the show again with you, and excited to tell our story. And I'm going to have to join Patreon because I want to do the Red October thing because it's one of my favorite submarine movies. So
Yeah,
it and Dust Boat.
That's one I probably saw Red October when I was like a pretty young kid, and I don't think I've watched it all the way through since then. But yeah, that's one I'm excited to rewatch, actually. Yeah, we do some good stuff on Patreon. Lately, we've been trending towards submarine movies just because it's kind of a good kind of set of things to compare against each other. We really enjoyed The Enemy Below that we did last month. That was a good one.
Looking forward to that because I'm a big submarine nerd. I've read almost every lost submarine book there is, and there's sort of a thing that I was in for a while and really enjoyed those. So yeah, that'll be good to look forward to.
Yeah, for sure. And we last had Paul on the show
last summer.
Probably almost a year ago, or was it last summer? We talked about the fire on the SS Normandy. That was a really informative episode. And Paul, you've also got a podcast of your own, if you'd like to remind everyone of that.
Thanks, and I appreciate your plugs that you've given us a few times for the Emergency Traffic podcast, where we talk about firefighters and paramedics, loss of lives during incidents, and explore those with a group. And you've given us some good shout outs, and we have some listeners that have actually reached out and said, we heard about you from Beyond the Breakers and interesting podcast, and love to learn more about firefighting and the emergencies that happen. So it's a very small but slowly growing podcast where we explore line of duty deaths and research what happened and the factors. And we have sometimes guest hosts on there who were directly involved either in the event or in the investigation. So we like it anyway. It's our little pet project, my hobby.
Yeah, what I like about emergency traffic is the fact that all of you have such direct experience with it, with different types of events, different types of fires you've been involved with. And the fact that you can kind of share that experience and how, sometimes you don't always agree on the same solution. You might have different suggestions or different things that you would have done in that situation. And that's really cool. I think listening as an outsider to see how these problems kind of get negotiated.
And we keep the disagreement quite tame on the recordings. It's much more passionate when we're not being recorded.
You can hear it just barely simmering under the surface there.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. So what else have you been up to lately? Watching, listening to, playing, creating?
Yeah, I love that you do that little intro, and I try to do that with our guys on our podcast too. I've been reading forever the book about Krupp, the arms manufacturer in Germany, in Essen, Germany.
William Manchester?
I believe so. That's correct. William Manchester. It's quite long. I just finished World War II, and they've decided to let Alfred Krupp out of jail because of the Korean War, and they want to rearm Germany. It's a good look at that. He's got it. I've got it on my Kindle.
I can even find the spot where I think I stopped. I got to page 366, and
I'm reading it over a long time.
That one. I think for some reason I was reading this one, and then that's when I think I started reading the book Iron Kingdom by Christopher Clark, I think his name is.
Okay.
Just like a very dense history of Prussia, and I think that broke me. I was like, I have to sit down one of these books.
Right. Well, last year I read Dreadnought by Massey, and then the subsequent to Dreadnought, which was Castles of Steel.
Hmm.
And I learned so much about pre-World War I and the European rulers and the royal families and how they're all related and stuff. So
Hmm.
that kind of got me into this one. And I've got I.G. Farben's book, the book about I.G. Farben, which is the DuPont of Germany, on my
Okay.
list to read next. And I've been teaching, as you know, I teach a little bit for a community college here, teach emergency management, so how to be prepared for emergencies and disasters. And I like to play games. I play a game called Snow Runner on the computer, which is truck driving in the bush. It's so realistically, they've developed a computer engine that drives the whole traction in mud and snow and ice. And so
Hmm.
it's quite realistic. So I play that a little bit too.
Awesome.
How about you?
It's been a lot of sports recently. The World Baseball Classic, that's been enjoyable just because I can't wait for real baseball to start. And this is better than watching spring training. U.S., we're actually playing Cuba tonight, the semifinal. March Madness, the NCAA basketball tournament, that's been on the last couple of days, holding a lot of my attention. Outside of sports, I finished the book The Voyage of the Armada by David Howarth, I think his name is pronounced. That was really good. It was a look at the Armada, specifically from the Spanish side of things. So relying on a lot of like correspondence and records and things like that. It was really cool. It was a very lively read. And then I moved right into another that's just called The Spanish Armada by Colin Martin and Jeffrey Park. So I guess Beyond the Breakers listeners are allowed to speculate as to why I'm reading multiple books on the Spanish Armada of 1588. We'll see when that comes back around.
Interesting. We're going to get into some tall ship sailing, huh?
Yeah, a little bit.
Battles. Yeah, excellent.
A lot of fun stuff there. Anytime I have to read about like sailing ships, the wind is actually a factor in all these things. Like today, some of the things we'll be discussing. Yeah, it's definitely a different ball game than when everything is engine powered.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess with that, I can hand things over to you. You can take the helm and tell us a story here today.
Oh, I like it. Take the helm and steer a course. This is a story about the loss of a classic sailing yacht, amongst many others that were lost in the same event. A very high-profile yacht race that they were competing in. The annual Sydney, Australia to Hobart, Tasmania race. They encountered a fatal storm in 1998 that killed 6 sailors and injured many more. 7 boats were abandoned at sea and 5 sank. These events initiated an unprecedented search and rescue effort in the histories of Australia and Tasmania, while the eyes of the whole continent were watching breathlessly. The race occurred, as it has, since 1945, when a group of Sydney sailors got the idea of racing along the Bass Strait to Hobart from Sydney. They call it hell on high water. That's what they call the Bass Strait. Unpredictable, withholding, bitchy are other words they use to describe this 200-mile body of water between southeastern shore of Australia and the northern tip of Tasmania. Most years, the Bass Strait lies dormant, allowing racers a calm passage, which is a relative term for winds of 40 knots, almost 50 miles an hour. They are common, and in 1950s, a blizzard actually struck the fleet, leaving sailors using anything they could find to shovel out the cockpits and clean off the decks of their sailing yachts. It wouldn't be fun, a blizzard on a sailboat.
Yeah, especially like, you mentioned calm being a relative term. It doesn't sound like a fun place to be there.
These are extreme. This is the extreme sailor race, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
In 1993, a storm dropped in from nowhere, blowing force 10, which is winds over 55 miles per hour, resulting in the sailor falling overboard and spending 5 hours in the water before being rescued. Because, of course, when it's blowing like that, it's pretty hard to turn around to go get the person, right?
Sure.
So, and even just keeping an eye on them. I know typical life-saving procedures on a boat are anytime somebody falls overboard, one person is appointed to just keep eyes on the person in the water so they don't lose them, because trying to find a person bobbing up and down in rough seas is a big problem. Looking at a map, just to describe it a little bit here, it's a deceptively simple race course directly south of Australian mainland to Tasmania. 735 miles of non-stop punishment blue water sailing. Unlike many other blue water sailor races, The sailors of the Sydney to Hobart do not have the option of steering away from bad weather. There's nowhere to go. You're in the middle between the two, the continent and the island. The winning sailor will stay on the rub line, which is the line they use, the straightest way to the destination. It's called the rub line. Straight across Bass Strait to Tasmania. Either side is a wide expanse of the southern Pacific Ocean that the round the world sailors always go on and get tipped over and knocked over and stuff. Yeah, that's where the biggest waves are and the constant winds.
I think here I'll just give a call back to one of our previous series that started on Patreon, but I think we've since released all of them on main. If you want more nonstop punishment and a little bit of Tasmania, you can check out our Prison Hulks episodes, in which we do talk quite a lot about the Australian penal colony system. I guess the only other reading I've really done about Tasmania is in the novels of Richard Flanagan. Familiar with him at all?
I'm not, but I'm familiar with quite a few of the around the world racers that have gone by there on their race or quest around the world. I think I saw a thing today on Facebook or something about Joshua Slocum, and that was the first single-handed around the world racer back. He was a Nova Scotia guy that built the boat and sailed around the world in the 1800s sometime. I have the book, but yeah.
To do that like on your own sounds particularly, I don't know, I feel like you'd just go insane being by yourself for that long.
Yeah, it has done that to some people. In fact, Bernard Montessier was a famous round the world racer that sort of changed his life during the race and just never came home. This race has the reputation of being the toughest in the world. Many sailors say that it is. The race starts on Boxing Day, and that timing may have something to do with how tough it is because the rush up to Christmas and everything, and then Boxing Day. The day after Christmas for the non-American people is Boxing Day. And with boats ranging from 30 feet to the maxis, which go up to 80 feet in length. So it's a real mix of skippers and boats and experience. Crews and owners are from a wide, diverse backgrounds, amateur sailors from all walks of life to professional racing sailors from the Olympics or around the world races, the America's Cup, etc. This diversity can give the race an everyman feel. You feel you could do it yourself, right? That's how it's so popular.
I see.
Many race sailors this year in 1998, when this happened, were unaware of a speech given in 1982, a few years before, by Alan Payne, a boat designer of some repute, who said, when addressing the Royal Ocean Yacht Racing Club of Australia, "One day a hurricane will hit the Sydney to Hobart race, and many of the modern racing boats built of lightweight composite materials will lack the structural integrity to withstand such a blow." He said, "It may take 100 years for the storm to happen, but one day a storm with 100-knot winds will strike the race."
You probably get into this later, but that was one of the bits I did pick up from the little bit of one of the reports I read was talking about the construction of these and how it's changed, obviously since the inception of the race. Changing from the wooden bodied yachts to the more modern. I forget what the material is called.
Fiberglass or carbon fiber.
Yeah, and just increasing this performance and kind of changing the whole style of them. I can see where this guy would be coming from, talking about someday this is going to happen.
The modern racing boats will tip over very far, but if they tip all the way over, they typically don't like to come back self-righting because they don't have that full keel that the old ships did. They have a smaller keel for speed, right?
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I feel like I saw the number somewhere of like 115 degrees being like one of the cutoffs for how far these things can go.
Right.
Which is pretty crazy.
It is. 45 degrees seems a lot when you're standing on the deck. This prediction will come true in 1998 when a storm of biblical proportions will rock the racing fleet. It's a little bit sort of like that perfect storm it took the Andrea Gale, if you will, several weather systems joining unpredictably. It'll be the worst sailing disaster in history, topping the England 1979 Fastnet race. Talk a little bit more about this later. The winds and seas of the Sydney-Hobart in 1998 were of a magnitude of almost twice what the Fastnet was, where it blew for 5 hours, not 2 whole days. So this thing just went on and on. They couldn't get away from it. So you wear the crews down, right? Their vigilance goes, their equipment fails, etc. With winds over 100 miles per hour and waves cresting 100 feet high, blue water sailors are adventurers. The race popularity grew slowly in the first 10 years, from 1945 after the year. It was first advertised in the Australian Yachting magazine in 1945. The boats back then were heavy cruising yachts. They were made for ocean-going trips with full keels, so the full length of the boat, instead of true ocean racers. But the racers became to be seen as the elites of Sydney sailors. The Sydney To Hobart of the 40s were as big and adventurous as the astronauts of the 1960s. Headlines of the race would read, "The race is too tough," or "A test of yachts and men." Of course, you got that whole challenge of, "You guys can do it. Come on, we can do it," right? Of the 9 yachts back in the first race in 1945, our main character of this episode was in that race, in the first race. The yacht was called Winston Churchill. She was a hewn pine planking, copper nails, and cloth sails. She was hauled out of the water a couple days before the race to let the hull dry, and then they put a coat of Johnson's floor wax polish on to help her slip through the water faster. Of course, we're talking 1945 here. They didn't have specially made yacht polishes.
Use whatever would work.
Yeah. Hey, Mom, I'm going to take the wax with me to the yacht club. Yeah, exactly. The Winston Churchill had been built in 1942 by a Tasman shipwright, Percy Cloverdale. She was considered the finest yacht in Australia. Legend has it that her namesake even gave his blessing to her name in a post-war visit to Australia. We'll come back to this later, as you guys often say. Given all the bravery and skill required, the Sydney to Hobart was regarded as no more than an Australian peculiarity, until the 1979 Fastnet tragedy off the coast of England, which is named for Fastnet Rock, a lighthouse off of Ireland's south coast, which marks the race's turnaround point. The Fastnet was the Super Bowl or World Cup of the sailing world, until this one happened. They start at the Isle of Wight off Portsmouth in England. The Fastnet race runs along the south coast of England and across the tempestuous Irish Sea to Fastnet Rock Lighthouse and back. In August 11th of 1979, with a cannon shot from the Royal Yacht Squadron, started the largest race ever at the time. 303 sailboats set off. Every competitor was aware of the 1931 race, where a gale swept a sailor overboard, and the 1957 race saw only 12 of the 41 yachts that started finish the race. In 1979, a Force 10 storm that was born in the Great Lakes of North America crossed the Atlantic in just 4 days. Somehow, the weather forecast missed the indicators and the storm hit the fleet suddenly on the third night out with tragic results. 15 sailors died from hypothermia or drowning. Mm-hmm. The problem with the Fastnet is because it's a short race. So many of the crews were under-equipped, without cold weather clothing, proper life rafts, and survival gear. But the conditions of the Fastnet were routine, basically, for people that sailed to Sydney-Hobart. They were used to strong winds and long, big storms coming in, squalls coming in and going. After 1979, the Sydney-Hobart became the standard by which blue water races were measured as the toughest race on Earth.
It's funny, the details here about the Fastnet race, because a couple weeks ago, I think I had shared just some teaser pictures from some of our upcoming guest episodes. And I had shared a picture of the Sydney to Hobart race. And there was a couple people either messaging or commenting Fastnet ? So I knew that was kind of one that, people were cognizant of, it's this is a big thing in sailing history too.
Yeah, and Fastnet was more well known around the world, whereas the Sydney to Hobart was sort of a local thing. So then when Fastnet happened, and then this one happened in Sydney to Hobart, then it became the tragic race, if you will. Mm. So back to the Sydney Hobart. As Taylor and Tanner like to say, this will be important later. During the race, boats are required to check in via a scheduled radio report and report their locations in alphabetical order at 3 a.m. and 2 p.m. every day. Sometimes the skippers will illegally miss the schedule to avoid letting competitors know where they are, because they can all hear it, right? They're doing this scheduled report and they get their position.
Yeah.
Sailing racers are very competitive. I mean, I've been in a few races. I'm not much of I am a sailor, but I'm not much of a racer. And I've gone racing with guys, and like they are extremely particular. Is don't sit there, move here, quick. Don't stand there. You're blocking the wind, or you're helping it, or whatever. Like they're very diligent about getting every ounce of speed out of their yachts.
Mm-hmm.
So if a boat misses 2 of these scheduled radio appointments, they are presumed lost. So it's something that they watch, to make sure that everybody's reporting in. That way they can keep tabs on the racers.
Is the presumed loss, is that from a purely safety perspective, or is that from a race perspective of saying you're out of the race if you miss 2 of these?
I'm not sure. I thought it was more along the they're going to initiate rescue efforts, but I read somewhere else where they don't. They just, because this boat was presumed lost and it showed up 4 days later and they're like, oh, okay, you made it. Great. So
okay,
I'm not really sure if I don't think it triggers anything, except that we're looking for it a little bit, if you will.
Using the term lost makes it seem like it is much more of like a safety focus of like, hey, we just want to know where these people are, rather than we think they're trying to cheat or whatever.
Yeah, it comes up later. Like the Australian Search and Rescue and Navy didn't really even, like, they weren't on notice that this race is going on and beware and stuff. Although they did participate and help a little bit, but it wasn't, they weren't worried that there was going to be a calamity.
Mm-hmm.
On December 26th of 1996, a couple of years before, which was the 50th anniversary of the race, there was 115 boats setting sail to race. It was the second largest only to the fleet in 94, which was the 50th anniversary. So we just, a few less, but we still had lots of boats in here. A boat of significant importance would be completing among this fleet in 1996, and this was the Winston Churchill. She had sailed in 17 Hobarts before, including the first one that we mentioned. And in the 1959 race, the Winston Churchill actually struck a whale in the Bass Strait and began to sink. The owner at the time wrapped sails around her leaking hull and steered her toward the nearest coast and ran her aground in what's appropriately named Wreck Beach.
Well, add that to the list with Danger Point in South Africa and Knife Island in Lake Superior. Wreck Beach is another good one.
Wreck Beach, yeah. And actually, when I didn't think about it until you remember things from your childhood. I didn't think about it until I was writing this. I actually have seen this tactic done once before. When I was a kid, our parents and my uncles had sailboats. And my uncle's sailboat, which was called the Beluga, was sailing on Lake Champlain. It was holed. The anchor had drug overnight, and they ran up on the rocks near Essex, New York. My father, I remember this part. You remember the things you remember when you're small. I was just like, I don't know, 5 or 7. Threw us and everything he had in the back of the car, big old Oldsmobile, and drove to the spot with pumps and tools and tarps and ropes and all kinds of stuff. And I remember going through customs with all this stuff in the back of the car, and they're going, because we lived in Canada, and it's like, where are you going with all this stuff and this equipment? He said, oh, I'm going to go rescue my brother-in-law's boat because it's been damaged. Oh, okay. So they wrapped sails around her and tied them up, and then they pumped her out, and the pressure from the water pushes on the sails and it plugs the holes.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then they were able to sail or motor her up to the closest marina to haul her out for repairs. As I said, the water pressure pushes the sails into the holes, plugs them to an extent that you reduce the water leakage to a point where the pumps can manage it and reduce the water level, and then you regain buoyancy in the ship.
That's pretty clever.
There you go. You learned something. Since the 1959 race, the Winston Churchill had cruised around the world. She was obviously a prestigious luxury yacht for Australia. The Russian Navy had used her for cadet training. To prepare her for the 1996 Sydney To Hobart Race, her new owner, Richard Winning, had bought her in 97, so 98 race, sorry. Had bought her in 97 for $90,000, spent $270,000 in those dollars. Inside was stripped from a 1940s cruising yacht to be like a 1990s racer. So the racing yachts are very bare bones inside. There's not a lot of luxuries and stuff like that. They're minimalistic to save weight and create space, right? Modern electronics and monitoring systems, were installed. The wooden mast was replaced with a taller aluminum mast to get more sail area and less maintenance. Modern winches and ropes, hydraulically powered steering gear was installed, and the rudder was modified. The water and fuel tanks were replaced, and mandatory rescue gear like flares, emergency radio beacons, otherwise known as EPIRBs, and first aid kits were installed.
I was waiting for where this part of it came in, because like you mentioned, I was surprised when you mentioned that she competed in the first one of these, and then thinking like, well, how is she still even in this race in 1998? So this answers a lot of those questions.
Right, and sailing races are handicapped based on the design and length of the sailboat. And so they give you sort of a few minutes extra depending on the type of boat you're sailing. I don't know how they do it for this race, but there's all kinds of handicap categories that will make it more equal, even if the one boat's going faster than the other one.
I had seen that in the report I was reading. It talked about I think it was like 3 different classes that they talked about. And I was curious if that was purely like a timing thing, or if they were actually competing as different classes. Like if you were competing against your other handicaps, or if it was just kind of still a full group competition.
It's probably both. It's probably within your class, and then within your class you get a handicap based on the length of your boat, because the longer the boat, the faster it will sail. Just because it supports more water, I guess. The new owner, Richard Winning, who was a long-time Sydney businessman, had purchased Winston Churchill because of her link with Australia's racing past. Proud of her as a historic link to the original design, even with all the upgrades, her outward appearance was almost the same as she was in 1945. She had a cabin leading below decks that would dominate the center of the hull in a traditional older yacht fashion, lined with portholes on each side so you can get a little bit of sunlight, so above the deck, if you will. And an A-frame skylight in the ceiling, which is nice to have, and you can open it when it's hot for ventilation, although maybe not a good thing to have when you're going heavy ocean sailing, because the water can go over the boat and break the skylight. It had a doghouse, they called it, lined with windows that sits just in front of the tiller or the helm, a perfect spot to take shelter while on deck. You could just kind of duck in there and keep dry, grab a cup of coffee, etc. These cabins result, though, in very little flush deck. So on a sailing yacht, flush decks are ideal because that means there's no obstructions on the decks. There's no cabins to jump over. You can run around and you can run around on the deck quickly to adjust sails, etc., like that. So typically they don't like having that, but this yacht had cabins. Because of the age of the crew, which was most of which was over 45 years old, care is more important than speed. Us old guys don't like to hurt ourselves. So the crew is mostly old friends. All but 2 were lifelong sailors. Really, this was just to do it for fun. They weren't really racing to be the first. They just wanted to do it again with this older yacht and have a good time.
Since you mentioned the age of the crew of the Winston Churchill, again, I don't know if this comes up later, but one of the things I was fascinated by reading about the entry requirements for this race is each yacht, you needed like a minimum of 3, I think it was, like qualified sailors. And then aside from that, it didn't really matter.
Right. It could be anybody.
The fact that there was no minimum age or no minimum like experience was really fascinating to me. Because like it, on the one hand, it makes sense. Like, of course, you want people have to get experience somewhere. So like if you're a novice sailor, sure, like you're going to need to learn this somehow. But yeah, I was just interested to see that, you know, this big renowned race for its toughness had no minimum individual entry requirement.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you have to be able to say it's Australia, so it's a little bit of Wild West here.
Right.
Same as we say here in Alberta, where I live. Like, we don't like to be ruled by all kinds of rules, right? So,
right.
Yep, that happens. Kind of like Wyoming, Montana. Yeah. So and it comes up later too in the after action reports and stuff about the age and experience. So Richard Winning, the owner, he hears the whispers from other sailors about the sheer lunacy of putting a wooden boat in the Sydney To Hobart Race. But he has no qualms. Since he raced her last year in 97 with no issues, before the race on Christmas Day, Winston Churchill is hauled out, rubbed down. I don't know if they used Johnson's floor wax this time. Maybe not, since it's 1998. And slipped her back in the water, the Grand Dame of Australia sailing. Here we go again. The owner winning tells all who ask, why would he consider sailing a 56-year-old wooden boat through some of the most treacherous water on Earth? His reply is, and she'll be likely here doing it long after we're all gone. Unfortunately, these words will come to haunt him later. You get that a lot, right? Unsinkable yachts and all that kind of stuff.
We do, unfortunately.
Yep, we get arrogant, and this is what happens. The thing about the Hobart is, because it's the day after Christmas, you get up before dawn to get to the boat, prepare for the race. You head out of the marina at 11 o'clock for the 1 o'clock start. After the stress of the start, all the boats trying to take off at the same time and get going, it keeps you going for a while, but after dark, the Christmas hangover and the tiredness from the last few days hits you, and all you want to do is sleep. And the whole crew is in the same boat, literally, because they all just want to rest. They've been through a busy week up to Christmas and Christmas celebrations, which, like anywhere else, a little bit too much eating, maybe a little bit too much imbibing. The absolute worst time for a storm to hit the fleet would be about midnight the first night out, because no one is ready.
This puts me in the mind of, have you seen Band of Brothers?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I have the series. Yep.
I'm thinking of the scene. It's like in the first episode where they give them that like spaghetti.
We're running up
spaghetti lunch, and then they make them run up the hill right after.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking of here. After this, everyone's tired out from Christmas. You've been stuffing yourself for a few days, and then you're going to go out on this grueling boat race.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Good analogy. Yeah. Band of Brothers. I think Currahee was the name of the mountain that they had to run up. Yep. 75 minutes into the race, the weather forecasts are facing concerns with several weather systems building in the area. The official Bureau of Meteorology issues a gale warning for the Bass Strait, a southerly change in winds reaching 55 knots and seas rising to 3 meters. This southerly wind hitting the south-flowing current means sailors can expect atrocious seas because you have a current going one way between Australia and Tasmania, and of course the winds going the other way. During the day on December 27th, the weather reports become more grim. After the scheduled radio call and the radio call in and a weather update, they give a weather update at the same time. Several boats decide to retire from the race, seeking shelter from the nearest port. The weather bomb is dropping into the race, and this will last almost 48 hours. Waves up to 80 feet high are recorded by deep-sea oil rigs in the area. Rescue helicopter pilots, while they're doing the many rescues that occur during the race, will use their altimeters to record wave heights up to 135 feet high, which is that's incredible. That's perfect storm stuff. The winds are hovering at 80 knots, and they gust over 100 knots, which is like 150 or 140 kilometers an hour, or miles an hour.
These are the kind of waves that we talked about with the Ocean Ranger,
Right.
Getting up high enough to smash these windows on these oil rigs.
Right, exactly. And you're going to be out there in your 35-foot sailing yacht.
Yeah.
Together, the wind and waves, they hunt for victims. They find one. The first victim was the 41-foot yacht Stand Aside. She is knocked down just before her afternoon radio schedule while listening to the others. Another yacht, Team Jaguar, is rolled and dismasted. So rolled completely over. When that happens, of course, often the sails and mast and everything get all ripped off. Fortunately, she came back upright. Emergency position indicating radio beacons, EPIRBs, start going off and transmitting positions to shore stations. The sailors don their life jackets and deploy life rafts tied to the disabled sailboats. So it's kind of a, what do we do? Do we get in the raft or do we stay with the boat? It's been dismantled, masted, or rolled over. It's damaged. But if it's still floating, most sailors will tie the dinghy behind and the life raft and stay in the boat until the boat is for sure going down, and then quickly jump into a dinghy. I was reading another book somewhere, listening to something. They say, maybe it was you guys on the podcast. So you never step down into a life raft. You want to be at equal footing when you get into the life raft, meaning your ship is going down.
We touched on that a little bit with the Hans Hedtoft, where
right,
the kind of discussing whether or not the captain would have even ordered people to lifeboats in those conditions, saying that like the safest place is still going to be on the ship, even as it's probably sinking here.
Right, right. Same here. I mean, atrocious seas, far from anywhere. You might as well stay with the boat as long as you can. I don't cover it in here, but they actually a couple of guys that were fatally injured during the race and the ensuing capsizes and stuff died from various reasons, and they actually strapped them into the bunks and left them in the abandoned yacht. And then someone went out and recovered the yacht, and the deceased happened in one or two instances in this race. I didn't go into all the different yachts that got damaged. I focused only on Winston, Churchill, and the others to give some context.
Mm-hmm.
The search and rescue centers begin to send civilian aircraft that are in the area. Some of them are taking pictures or news video of the race, so the news networks are already out there to search for vessels in distress, just to get a good location on them. Then requesting helicopters to stand by the boats until rescuers can arrive so they can find them. Some other sailboats will sail to the rescue, but the weather is too atrocious to maneuver or attempt a ship-to-ship rescue close to the stricken vessels. They could only wait to pick up survivors in the water if it comes to that. And that happened with this stand aside, is that another boat came by and just waited beside them because they couldn't try to get too close to them, because you'll bash your boat to bits trying to get close to them, right? And have your own emergencies.
Right.
A dozen more yachts succumbed to the wind and waves, and the Australian Search and Rescue War Room, over a dozen EPIRB icons flash on the electronic maps. They have military aircraft dropped sonobuoys, so little buoys that they can drop near the places that emit a radar signal or radio signal, so that they can gauge the drift of the yachts. So they can say, okay, your position was here. They drop a buoy in there, they record how fast it moves, and they can make an estimate as to where you're going to drift to assist in the searches. Australian Search and Rescue is prioritizing the radio distress calls. High priority, meaning you're sinking or sunk. Medium priority, meaning you have a mechanical failure, you're dismasted, lost your steering, etc. Or low priority, scared to death and giving up, like, get me out of here, this is crazy. Sending rescue helicopters with swimmers and winches, because that's the only way to get these people out of the boats, out of the water. Normally, the EPIRBs act as a homing beacon for rescuers, but there were so many EPIRBs going off that searchers had to visually find each boat, because they just couldn't pinpoint them, because they're all in a fairly close area, relatively speaking, in Bass Strait, to find each boat. Due to the location in the middle of the vast southern Pacific Ocean, Australia has one of the best ocean search and rescue forces in the world. There's quiet grumbling within the search and rescue community, though, that the blue water sailors seem to take this for granted and maybe taking risks that they shouldn't, knowing someone's always going to save them, which you kind of get. I can get that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
The racers might actually be surprised to know that the search and rescue teams were not on any special alert or standby for the race. The Sydney To Hobart Race is a private event. The Navy search and rescue will only be called out as a last resort. They did participate. The Navy did send a ship to sail along with them to act as a radio repeater, so that the small transmitters in the sailboats could reach the shore and stuff like that, so they could repeat messages. But that's about it, the extent of their activation.
I guess that makes sense in that, like, since they are like a government organization, I guess they can't really be on standby for like a private event, acting as free security, I guess, basically.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense on the one hand, unless it's like an absolute emergency.
Yeah, you'd have to pay to have them on standby if you wanted an extra assignment or something like that.
Yeah.
Which they're all going out there expecting that they're going to do fine unless something breaks down or they have a medical emergency, right? At dusk on the 27th of December, the same number as the number on her sails, Winston Churchill is among the pack sailing against a storm. Stanley Steamer, the man who spearheaded the rebuilding of the yacht for the race, which included adding additional 3,500 fasteners, is at the helm as a sailing master for the race. Stanley is very experienced, and he's perched at the doghouse as the Winston Churchill rolls up and down the monstrous seas at the prescribed 60 to 70 degree angle. So you always angle your boat towards the wind a little bit. You don't go directly into the wind. You don't go too far off wind. You go 60 to 70 degrees, and that's the way you want to approach the waves for the least impact, if you will, on the waves going up and down them. The yacht's long keel digs in, providing much better control than most of the modern racing yachts with the small keels, wing keels, and bulbs and stuff, because it doesn't slide sideways as much. The crew's wondering about the storm and Winston Churchill's age. She can't do this forever. They are considering heaving to, as she did back in the 1945 gale. So that would be just putting up one or two minimal, very small sails and just pointing into the wind, sort of. You actually put the front sail, the jib, on the wrong side. And you tie the helm or the tiller on the opposite side. So the yacht is constantly hobby horsing, trying to turn into the wind, but it can't. And it falls off, and it turns into the wind, and it can't. And it's called heaving to, and you maintain a relatively stable position. You'll drift slowly with the waves. The two main tactics in a storm, heaving to or running with the wind. And that's where you'll turn the yacht downwind, and you'll flow a sail or a drogue in the water behind, or chain or rope or anything to keep the stern towards the wind, so it's up towards the waves. Those are the two tactics that you would use in a storm. So they're considering heaving to, but there's no reason they can't do that again now. But before they decide to change tactics, they're going up a wave, and Stanley feels the Winston Churchill stall on the upward face of a huge 80-foot wave. They are not yet at the top, but Winston Churchill ran out of power or forward momentum to carry her over the crest of the wave from the limited amount of sail she had out. The wall of water and foam arcs over the yacht. She slides backwards and halfway down the wave. 25 tons of water estimated dump on the top of the 56-year-old boat and throw her onto her side. Water shatters all the doghouse portholes, and the cabins are flooded. Crew members are sloshed around violently against any hard surface, causing numerous injuries. Fortunately, she does not roll over, but she's flung onto the next wave. So similar to what happened to Stand Aside, where she was knocked flat. Several on-deck crew members are now dangling aloft from their safety harnesses, caught in the rigging, because everybody on deck's got a safety harness on. The boat gets knocked over, all the water hits and everything. They're all tangled up in the rigging, and they get lifted off the deck. So you have to go rescue them. The Stanley crawls to rescue them. You always carry a knife on you when you're a sailor. Always have a sharp knife on you so you can cut lines or rescue people. The owner, Winning, tries to start the engine, and Stanley flips on the bilge pump switches inside the cabin. Looking below, Stanley sees catastrophic damage. The newly mounted taller aluminum mast has drilled down through the bottom of the hull, and 6 feet of the bulwarks, or the sides of the yacht, are missing from the side of the yacht. Over a foot of water is already covering the floor. Winning gets the engine started, but it only runs a couple of moments. It's critical to get it going to pump out and motor to the wounded yacht back to Eden, the closest port. But the motor sputters and dies. After several attempts, they determine that the engine is waterlogged, probably too much water in the engine compartment, and will not run.
As our guest last week, Tom said, water doesn't play. And yeah, the idea of this, the mast getting drilled through the bottom of this thing is pretty intense scene here.
Right, you got that water pushing on the mast when it's on its side or partially upside down, so that pressure is going the other way, right? And the yacht is pushed into it. Maybe the new mast versus the old mast, it's a different structure. Maybe that was the cause. Never did hear that. Crewman Bruce Gold, a veteran of 32 Sydney to Hobart races, takes the helm as crewman Paul Luteman is just waking up below from the sudden impact. He's in the cabin of a flooded ship. Can you imagine that? You're out there at sea, you're in this race, you're sleeping, trying to get a couple hours or 20 minutes shut-eye. Seawater's above his waist, fumbling to don his wet weather gear. Winning yells through the companionway, "We're sinking, mate. Best get your things together and make your way up on deck." I can just hear that in an Australian accent.
Seems almost an understatement, given the circumstance here.
Right.
Like, yeah,
right.
It's probably the best thing to do.
The crew's getting the life rafts up on deck. There's no doubt Winston Churchill is sinking. She has a big hole in her side. The antique yacht that represents a living history of Australia, sailing, World War II, ties to England, is about to become history. Winning picks up the radio and broadcasts, "Mayday, mayday, mayday." The crew is donning life jackets, and considering their fate in the flimsy-looking life rafts. Gould is at the steering wheel, of the half-sunken yacht under bare poles, no sails, and Winning is still broadcasting the emergency. This is Winston Churchill. We are holed, taking on water rapidly. No motor, no pumps. Winning comes back up on deck. The life rafts are inflated and tied to the stern. Stanley Steamer asks, "Any luck on the radio?" Winning replies, "I spoke with the news chopper on the VHF radio because the high-frequency radio is out of action. They have our position, but I have no idea when they are coming to get us." "All right, boys, into the rafts," Steamer orders. These are not perfect life rafts. They are not the SOLAS, which is safety of life at sea, such as those used by the around-the-world racers, the cheaper local yachtsman type. They're in accordance with the Australian Yachting Federation. Good, but not perfect. They're lightweight and subject to the winds of heavy weather.
They mention here, that they have our position, but, we don't know when they're coming to get us. At this point, do they know that other yachts are also having emergencies? Or are they more concerned with their own stuff here?
They probably don't unless there was another sked, so they probably haven't heard that people have dropped off. They knew some people retired, but they wouldn't hear of the other yachts having, unless they're monitoring, but they're probably hands full and stuff like that. So they may not know the conditions. They can assume that, wow, if this is doing it to us, what's it like for some of the others?
Right.
And there's more on the position later that comes back here to haunt us a little bit. Now, stepping off the deck of a sailing ship, they're home. To swim and climb into a flimsy life raft, the gentlemen of the Winston Churchill are scared to death. If only there was a way to save her. Gould says it stays at the helm. Her decks are awash. All that pokes up out of the water is the doghouse roof. As the crew climbs into the raft, then the EPIRB is activated. The rafts are tied together, and Winston Churchill slips below the waves. And there's a long story that I didn't get into of the trauma in the rafts, because the one raft lost its floor completely. They're just kind of hanging there for 23 hours in this raft, which we're going to talk a little bit about, but I didn't get too deep into it. After 17 Sydney-Hobarts and 56 years, one collision with a whale, countless parties, cruises, around the world tour, and a benediction by her historical namesake, Winston Churchill is no more. 9 men floating in 2 rafts is all that's left of the majestic yacht, now disappearing beneath the angry waves. Survival is, of course, the objective now. The wind tears at the rafts, splitting them apart, snapping the halyard between them. Soon the little drogues tied beneath the rafts to hold them bottom down and slow them in the waves. You can imagine this raft sliding down the face of an 80-foot wave. They broke, and the rafts were flying, airborne, picking up the 3 or 4 or 5 guys in them, flipping over and over, spilling out all the emergency supplies, flares, rations, water. One man struggling to stay afloat in the rafts. The story of the next few hours in the rafts is a whole other chapter. The news networks broadcast the story of the foundering Winston Churchill as the lead story on Sunday night. The devastation of the fleet is total, with all kinds of rumors and speculation about the missing yachts and the ones that have abandoned the race, running for shelter to stay afloat. The Mayday call of the Winston Churchill was heard on the sail training ship Young Endeavour, the Royal Australian Navy. She has been following the race as a radio relay point to the shore bases. The captain of Young Endeavour, Lieutenant Commander Neil Gallantly, heard the call on the radio, and ran immediately to the communications center from the bridge to discuss the situation. The radio operators were momentarily stunned in silence. Many of the crew on Young Endeavour knew crew members of the Winston Churchill and had sailed with them, already dealing with several emergency situations, and had to be momentarily bombarded with more. Interesting story about Young Endeavour. She was built in 1987 and gifted to the Australians in 1988 by the British government to celebrate Australia's bicentenary. She was a brigantine. So to say in simple terms, she was square-wigged on the foremast, so crossways sails like a clipper ship or the USS Constitution, and gaff-rigged longitudinal sails with booms on the top and bottom, like the America or the Bluenose on the rear mast. She's 44 meters long with a beam of 7.8 meters and a draft of 4 meters. She sails with a crew of 10 and 24 sailing trainees. The captain of Young Endeavour plotted Winston Churchill's position. Unknown to them, though, Winston Churchill's position was estimated because the Mayday radio call was based on dead reckoning. All the charts and electronics on Winston Churchill were wiped out during the knockdown and flooding. So they didn't really know where they were. They were guessing. Mm-hmm. According to the Mayday call, she was only 11 miles from Young Endeavour. Because Winston Churchill was sinking and the crew was abandoning ship in seas where yachts were floundering, never mind life rafts, Lieutenant Commander gallantly decided she was a priority and decided to change course for a rescue. Despite extreme conditions, this was the plan. She'd done this before. During a gale that ravaged in 1993, her crew had performed an excellent rescue from an overturned yacht. A plan was developed for the rescue. When they arrived, they had a diver on board and everything they were planning. Because it was so rough, it would be too rough to launch her diesel-powered, rigid-bottom inflatable boat. The plan was to launch a tethered raft and let the raft drift down towards the survivors, with Young Endeavour holding position upwind, creating a bit of a lee. During the war, lots of ships would do that. They would create a lee, and they'd actually pour oil on the water to calm the waves to effect a better rescue. Wouldn't be environmentally considered now. But
I have heard stories of that where people have had to, dump some oil in the water to sort of calm things down, thinking,
right.
in the moment, maybe you're not as focused on the health of the planet and you just want to survive.
Yeah, you want to rescue these people. En route to rescue Winston Churchill's crew, they received a new position report. This required her to make a course change. The seas were on her starboard or right side. With only the storm sails up for stability, she was under power. She just keeps the storm sail up so it prevents the ship from rocking so much with a bit of wind in the sails. She had two powerful Perkins V8 diesel engines. Nevertheless, turning dead downwind in a 40 to 50 foot high wave is very dangerous. I can't remember if I talk about this later or not. That's a jibe. Turning downwind is called a jibe. Turning upwind is a tack. And a jibe is definitely the most dangerous sailing maneuver that you ever have to perform because it's violent. Once the wind catches you the other side, it flips you the other way. Yep.
Yeah, I've definitely heard the term tacking into the wind. Never heard the opposite. Never heard the term jibe.
Yeah, G-Y-B-E, jibe. All watches and all hands were on deck. Foul weather gear, life vest, and safety harnesses for the jibe. Just after the jibe was being completed, a monster wave appeared, picked up the massive 239-ton ship as if she was a bathtub toy, heeled her over, and almost capsized her. Through excellent seamanship on the part of the captain and crew, the full-keeled design of the ship, she swung back upright. She headed for the new position, now considerably more distance. Night was falling, and visibility was down to 100 meters, so 300 feet. The search was on and would continue for most of the next day. As this is all happening, Aussie search and rescue is overwhelmed. Multiple worst-case scenarios, boats sinking, boats missing, men overboard. Just as rescue crews hoist sailors aboard, another mayday is called in. There's even an aviation fuel shortage at some of the refueling points that they could use, forcing a tanker ship to be diverted to resupply stores. Fortunately, the storm blew the fleet closer to the rescue stations, allowing for quicker turnaround times on the rescues. Because there's only so many helicopters that can hoist, right? That's the big thing, is not all helicopters can hoist. You have to have a winch-equipped helicopter that can put a rescue swimmer in the water and then hoist people up.
Mm-hmm.
Soon the Australian Navy is called out to assist, with multiple marine helicopters being deployed, as well as numerous fixed-wings aircraft and private ocean-going vessels joining the search and rescue efforts. The next afternoon, most of the rescues are completed and yachts are found, except for the 9 men of the Winston Churchill. Clinging to their mostly deflated life rafts, over 40 aircraft are searching. At about 4:30, a plane passes and sees some of them. The two rafts have now been long separated. The rafts have been blown 100 miles in the 23 hours since the Churchill sank. No one thought to look so far away, which delayed the rescues. 7 of the 9 people are rescued, but the 2 in the smaller raft are still missing. It's just before dark, 8 p.m., and the plane sees no heat signatures from the raft when they find it, thinking that the men are likely dead. But no, they are so cold that their heat signatures didn't register on the thermal imaging camera or forward-looking infrared on the helicopter. After a significant struggle to get the two frozen, waterlogged, weakened men into the rescue chopper, success. Churchill's crew is saved. In all, 55 men have been rescued, 6 men are dead, 2 of them lost at sea, and 24 boats abandoned.
Wow.
Yeah, what can you say? Wow.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a unique story because we so rarely deal with stories of multiple craft being affected and these more widespread issues. We've never, covered or really heard a story quite like this one.
I mean, search and rescue, how many can you deploy at once? It's sort of a Hurricane Katrina event, if you will, for the Coast Guard, in that we've got all these people that we need to rescue now. And how do you prioritize them? And when you're reading the books about this event, the Knockdown and Fatal Storm, it talks about how they had to decide, okay, well, if you're sinking or sunk, we're going to go to you first.
Right.
If you're just drifting, well, you're next. And if you're just scared or want help, you're next. Because then they had the news choppers were doing all the spotting because they just had to wait. They had to wait a long time for the rescue crews to get spooled up and out there. It takes a little while.
You rarely see these stories where the rescue people have to essentially like triage the people that they are potentially going to have to rescue, just because there's so many of them. I mean, the only other one I can think of was when we talked about the movie The Finest Hours, because you had kind of the two vessels who were sinking at the same time, and the one crew kind of worried that this other one's sinking, saying, well, there's no way they're going to come to us because this other one's also sinking. Certainly a unique and pretty scary story, honestly, thinking about being out there on these pretty small craft.
So the investigation, which I think you've read from the Royal Australian Yacht Club, after the race, they had an investigation, of course, and it made the following recommendations were made. Compulsory reporting of strong winds over 40 knots and high waves by the yachts. So this wasn't compulsory. They didn't have to report what the conditions were. And there was 2 weather reports. There was the government weather report, but some of the yachts actually hired a meteorologist of their own to give them information. And that comes up a little bit later here. The broadcasting of additional layman forecasts to the racers was now required because some of the yachts had this information, but it wasn't broadcast to everybody because it wasn't national.
Mm-hmm.
The compulsory assessment from each skipper regarding the boat and crew's capability before entering Bass Strait. So, like, are you good? We're good, right? Kind of thing. Just getting a thumbs up from each skipper before they go. Sort of the mission control, green for go, right? The increase in requirements for crew experience and the minimum age to be 18 or older, because there was a young woman on one of these ships, 14 or 16 years old, right? That ended up like, wow. Luckily, she survived. They didn't think she was going to make it. The introduction of mandatory qualifying races for entry. So just like the America's Cup, you want to compete in the America's Cup, you've got to compete in other ones first. The same as all other, Olympics, national sporting events, whatever.
I was thinking of like marathons. If I wanted to enter the Boston Marathon tomorrow, they wouldn't let me because like I've never come close to running a marathon before. I've never run one of the qualifying races. So
right. So this isn't rock. You look at these and you kind of go, wow, how come they weren't there already, right? But with the emergency traffic podcast, we have the same problem all the time, right? Is like, why aren't you doing this? This has been going on. You knew about this, but they couldn't get the funding, or they didn't believe it was a real problem, and they just keep on doing it over and over.
Like those, and like with the ones we talk about, is unfortunately the awareness raiser is very often 10, 20 people are dead, and now we kind of realize, oh, this is in fact a problem. Yes, we can do something. Yes, we can make these changes. Finally.
Yep. Compulsory attendance of 30% of the crew to weather, safety, and search and rescue seminars. Go think. 30% of your crew has to take training before we go sailing. compulsory use of highly accurate 406 megahertz EPIRB for increased accuracies. In the reports, many of the EPIRBs were of a older, less expensive design that weren't as accurate in positioning. So they're mandatory that they get the newer EPIRBs on all the yachts so that they have better positions if there is an emergency, which would have helped a lot.
And I assume, that would have helped at least with some of the location, because if you have these like less specific locations and you have so many in one spot, you've got one big mass of EPIRB.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Upgraded personal safety equipment, so wetsuits, life jackets, and life rafts. Improved radios for communications, including the requirement of a handheld VHF radio on each yacht as a last communication resort during potential search and rescue efforts, so that they can, call the helicopter or the search plane when they get visual to tell them their condition or try to call them out. And then last but not least, we talked about this near the start. Each yacht is required to obtain an International Measurement System Certificate of Stability Compliance, basically a test of the stability of the yacht and the ability to self-right. Potentially, depends which category they specify, like your typical Coast Guard rescue vessel. They have to be completely self-righting. No matter what you do to them, they always back up, deck up. Where sailboats, it's not that, but they have to be able to do, like you said, 115 degrees or whatever and self-right. So depending on the category. So each yacht had to, and I've seen them do these tests. They actually take the boat and they take a crane and they pull it down. On the water, and then they let it go, and it has to come back up. It's pretty cool to watch. You can see them on YouTube or whatever. That's it. That's all I have about the Sydney to Hobart race, where the Winston, Churchill, and many others were lost.
This one is pretty fascinating, and definitely in the show notes, maybe I'll include the titles of those books that you were using as reference.
I'll email them to you.
Awesome. Because this one is, seems like one where there's definitely a lot more reading that people can do if they want to get deeper into it. We've dabbled a little bit in sailing and in racing yachts, but this was kind of a lot more detail in terms of how these things are constructed and how they're used.
Now, there's a couple of tall ships that foundered. I sent them in that initial list when we were talking a couple months ago. I'd have to look them up again. But there was one was Canadian and the other one, I'm not sure. They were like north of Bermuda or something. They foundered.
Was it you that recommended the book "The Ship and the Storm"?
I think so.
Hurricane Mitch and the Loss of the Fantôme.
Yeah, right. That was a tall ship, I think.
Yeah, that's one that I grabbed. I think when you recommended it. I haven't read it yet, but that's definitely one that we'll get into at some point.
Yeah, I think I have it. Where I thought there was a Canadian tall ship too that sank in the Atlantic somewhere. Sail training ship kind of thing. Anyway, yeah, and submarines. That's cool. I gotta. So, what are you watching the movie together on Patreon, or what are you doing?
So what we normally do is we just watch the movie and then we discuss it. We kind of do like a summary through it, and then we just kind of comment on it throughout. Okay. So it's a fun time. We've got another guest coming on for that one, but we're probably going to be watching a lot more submarine movies in the future. So we'd love to have you on for one.
Yeah, that'd be great. I've got quite a few. There's an obscure one that I found. Let me get the book. Hang on. It's not a movie though. It's just a submarine failure. Sub Smash, it's called. Where the heck is it? It's a British submarine that was lost in the Mediterranean.
Interesting.
I know. I'd never heard of it. Well, Under Pressure is a good one. The Terrible Hours is another good one. Under Pressure is the final voyage of submarine S5. Terrible Hours is the one where they rescued. That's by Peter Moss. They rescued the sailors from the sub.
That's a bit of a rarity for sub disasters.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. K-19, which is of course the real story. They made a movie.
Yes, I think is on our list to watch. K-19, The Widowmaker at some point.
We could do that with Emergency Traffic. We could watch some of the fire movies and then tear them apart.
That'd be great because you guys have the the expertise to do that.
Yeah, they're so phony. We usually don't. My wife won't let me watch Chicago Fire or anything because I get too excited.
I think we've got 3 minutes left on our Zencaster here. So I want to make sure that we're able to plug your show once more here. I do just want to say thank you to Paul for coming back on and sharing this story with us. And then also, you should definitely check out Paul's podcast, Emergency Traffic. And you can find Emergency Traffic also on Twitter. What's the Twitter handle?
Podcast Traffic.
Podcast Traffic. And then, are you on any other social media?
Facebook, yeah. Emergency Traffic Podcast, Twitter, and that's it. And email. Emergency Traffic Podcast at Gmail.
Can't recommend that podcast enough because it has some similarities to the types of stories we cover, but then in many ways it's different, and just the way that the hosts are able to discuss these things from their own personal backgrounds and expertise. It's really a good listen. Thanks a lot.
You're my inspiration. That's why I was listening to you guys and I was wanting to do a podcast, and it's like, hey, I could do like these guys.
So yeah, I guess we'll sign off here. Thank you again, Paul, and then we'll just be back with you next week with, I forget what we're doing for our next episode, but it'll be something.
It'll be great. Thanks.